But if I had the choice, I would choose her." Those words, spoken by her own husband, reached Abigail Ashford through a half-open door. Her hand pressed against her rounded belly, her wedding ring still cold on her finger. She didn't scream. She didn't weep. She walked back to her room, sat down in the dark, and made a decision that would shake the foundations of Ashford Manor to its very core. If you've ever loved someone who couldn't see your worth, stay with us. Subscribe and let Abigail's story speak straight to your heart. The night Abigail Mercer Ashford's world split open, the rest of Ashford Manor was perfectly still. It was the kind of stillness that settles over a great house when everyone inside it has gone to bed believing tomorrow will look exactly like today. The kind of quiet that makes a woman believe for just a moment that she is safe. Abigail had believed that once. She wasn't sure when exactly she'd stopped. She lay in the wide mahogany bed she shared with her husband, or was supposed to share on the nights he didn't find reasons to stay elsewhere in the house, with one hand resting on the swell of her abdomen and the other curled at her side listening. The baby had been restless all evening, turning in small, insistent ways, as if it already understood something its mother was still trying to deny. The physician, Dr. Hargrove, had come by that afternoon. He'd pressed his fingertips together in that precise, careful way of his and told her what she already knew. "Rest, Mrs. Ashford. No excitement, no cold drafts, no unnecessary movement after dark." She had nodded and thanked him and poured him tea from the good silver service because that was what Abigail did. She managed things. She kept the surfaces smooth. But the nausea had woken her somewhere past midnight, that rolling, persistent kind that didn't ask permission, and she'd lain in the dark for a long while, hoping it would pass on its own, before finally accepting that she needed water and perhaps a bit of bread from the kitchen. And most of all, she'd told herself this was not the real reason she wanted to know where Benjamin was. He hadn't come to bed. That wasn't unusual. She'd grown accustomed to the empty space beside her, to the way she woke in the night sometimes and reached toward his side and found only cool linen. She had grown accustomed to many things she should never have had to accept. But tonight, with the baby pressing low and her body aching and the house wrapped in silence, she needed to know he was somewhere nearby. That was all. Just nearby. She wrapped herself in her wool dressing gown and took up a single candle from the bedside and moved out into the hallway. Ashford Manor ran long and dark at that hour. The portraits along the upper corridor seemed to watch her as she passed 3 generations of Ashford men with the same square jaw and the same careful eyes looking down at the woman who had married into their line with expressions she'd never quite been able to read. Approval, perhaps. Or its absence. She moved toward the east wing, toward the study where Benjamin kept his accounts and his correspondence, and increasingly his evenings. The study door was not closed. It was open a crack just enough, and the firelight from within threw a long orange stripe across the hallway floor. She could hear voices before she reached it. Low, intent, the kind of voices that know they should not be heard. She recognized them both. The first was her husband's. The second belonged to Olivia Whitmore. Abigail stopped walking. Olivia Whitmore was the daughter of Colonel Whitmore of the neighboring Whitmore estate, a woman of considerable charm and considerable awareness of that charm, who had grown up alongside Benjamin Ashford, and who had never in all the years Abigail had known her quite managed to look at Benjamin the way women looked at men they'd already let go of. Abigail had told herself it meant nothing. She had told herself that many times. She stood in the hallway now and did not move. "You cannot keep pretending, Benjamin." Olivia's voice was low and precise. It had that particular quality that well-bred women cultivated the ability to be perfectly controlled, even when saying incendiary things. "This arrangement you've made for yourself, this marriage, you cannot look me in the eye and tell me you are happy." A pause. The fire snapped. "Olivia." Benjamin's voice was tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from a long day. The kind that comes from a long time. "What you're asking me to—" "I'm not asking anything. I'm observing. There is a difference." Another silence. Abigail's hand found the wall beside her. She pressed her palm flat against the plaster and held it there. "I didn't come here looking for this conversation." Benjamin sounded like a man who had been having this conversation in his own head for so long, It had worn grooves into him. "I didn't." "Then tell me it's wrong." Olivia's voice sharpened just slightly. "Tell me I've misread everything. Tell me what you feel in this marriage is enough, and I'll leave you to it. I'll go back to Virginia, and you'll never hear from me again." The silence that followed was the most devastating thing Abigail had ever heard. Because Benjamin Ashford, her husband, the father of the child, she carried the man who had stood beside her in the chapel at Charlottesville and spoken his vows in that measured, careful voice of his, did not say a word. Not for a long, terrible moment. When he finally spoke, it was quiet, almost gentle. "You know I never wanted this life." Abigail's breath left her body. "Then why?" Olivia pressed. "Why stay? Why not, Benjamin? You have the means. You have the standing. No one could compel you if you truly—" "Because Abigail is carrying my child." Silence. "That is the only reason?" Olivia asked. Another pause, shorter this time, more definitive. "If I had the choice," Benjamin said quietly, "I would choose you." The candle flame in Abigail's hand trembled. She looked down at it, and she thought very distinctly and very clearly, "I am not going to drop this candle. I am not going to make a sound. I am not going to let either of them know I am standing here." She turned around. She walked back down the hall. She walked back to her room, and she set the candle on the nightstand, and she sat down on the edge of the bed very carefully, because her legs were not as steady as she needed them to be. She sat there in the half-dark with her hand on her abdomen, and she breathed. In, out. Slow and deliberate, the way Dr. Hargrove had instructed when she told him about the headaches, the way she'd learned to manage everything she was not permitted to fall apart over. She looked at the wedding ring on her left hand. She took it off. It was a beautiful ring. A thin gold band with a single oval sapphire set in a delicate filigree mounting Benjamin's grandmother's ring, the one his mother had pressed into his hand the morning of their wedding, with tears on her cheeks. The one Abigail had worn every day for 2 years and 3 months without once taking it off, not even to sleep. She held it between her thumb and forefinger in the dark, and she did not cry. She thought about crying. She considered it the way a woman considers stepping into cold water, acknowledging it fully before deciding against it. There was a great pressure behind her eyes and a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the baby, and she sat with those things and let them exist without giving them permission to overwhelm her. Because she was Abigail Mercer Ashford, and she had survived worse than this. She had grown up in the household of her uncle Edward Mercer after her parents died of fever when she was 9 years old. Edward Mercer was a man of business and limited sentiment who had taken her in out of obligation and made sure she understood the distinction. She'd had her own room and 3 decent meals a day, and an education that leaned heavily toward household management and the cultivation of useful skills, because Edward Mercer believed that women of uncertain fortune had best make themselves indispensable rather than pretty. It turned out to be excellent preparation. She'd met Benjamin Ashford at a gathering hosted by the Calloway family in the autumn of 1811. She had been 22, and he had been 26, and he had stood at the edge of the room watching the dancing with the look of a man who found parties fundamentally exhausting but had not yet figured out how to leave them. She had been standing near the window for the same reason. They'd exchanged a few words about the music, then a few more about the Calloway estate's peculiar approach to drainage. Then, without quite meaning to, they'd talked for an hour and a half. She'd thought afterward that she might like him very much. She had not thought then about Olivia Whitmore. Olivia had been in Virginia that autumn visiting cousins. She was always seeming to be just elsewhere, present enough to matter, absent enough to seem safe. Benjamin had courted Abigail with a kind of steady, methodical attention that she'd found reassuring rather than romantic. He wasn't a man who made grand gestures. He was a man who remembered things she mentioned in passing, that she preferred tea to coffee, that she found formal dinners tiring, that she had a fondness for the particular smell of old books, and who took quiet note of them and incorporated them into his consideration of her. She had taken that for love. She had been partly right. It was consideration. It was regard. It was, she now understood, a genuine and decent care for her as a person that had nothing to do with the choice he'd told Olivia Whitmore he would have made if he could. Respect and desire are not the same thing. She'd had 2 years and 3 months to learn that lesson. She sat with the ring in her hand until she heard the study door open down the hall, and then the careful, soft sound of footsteps, and then silence again. She didn't hear which direction the footsteps went. She didn't hear Benjamin's door. She didn't move. After a while, she couldn't have said how long she heard his footsteps in the corridor outside their room. The door handle turned. He came in quietly, the way he always did when he thought she was sleeping. He set down his candle, and she heard the sounds of him removing his coat, his cravat moving to the wash basin. "You're awake." He said it without surprise. He had always been perceptive about her, even when he failed to see her. "I couldn't sleep." Her voice was perfectly steady. She was very proud of that. He came to the other side of the bed and sat down. She could feel the weight of him on the mattress, the slight shift of the frame. She kept her hand closed around the ring so he wouldn't see she'd taken it off. "Abigail." He said her name the way he always did, carefully, with a particular deliberateness, as if he was aware of its weight. Is it the baby? Should I send for Hargrove?" "No, the baby is fine. I'm fine." A pause. "You don't seem fine. I told you I couldn't sleep, that's all." She could feel him looking at her in the dark. Benjamin Ashford was not a demonstrative man, but he was not an unaware one. He noticed the temperature of a room. He noticed when things had shifted. "Abigail." "I'm tired, Benjamin." She lay down and pulled the counterpane up and closed her eyes. "Go to sleep." He didn't move for a moment. She could feel the weight of whatever he was considering. Then he lay down too, and the room went quiet. She lay in the dark with her wedding ring pressed inside her closed fist, and she stared at the ceiling, and she thought. She was very good at thinking. Here is what Abigail Mercer Ashford knew by morning: she was not going to fall apart. She was not going to confront Benjamin in a tearful scene that would allow him to feel guilty and sorry and ultimately eventually forgiven by the sheer fact of her visible suffering. She had seen that particular story play out enough times in the lives of women she knew, and it never ended well for the woman. The man suffered for a while and felt terrible, and eventually that suffering became its own form of currency he spent on himself. She would not give him that. She was not going to leave immediately. She was 6 months along with no income of her own secured and no place to go except back to Edward Mercer's house, which she would sooner sleep in a field than do. She had a child coming. She would not act without planning. And she was not going to pretend she hadn't heard what she'd heard. What she was going to do was something that took more steadiness than grief and more courage than confrontation. She was going to change. Not for Benjamin. Not to punish him. Not even to make him see her, though that would come. She was going to change because she had spent 2 years and 3 months pouring herself into the project of being Benjamin Ashford's wife. And she had somewhere along the way stopped asking what she was building for herself. It was time to ask. She was at the breakfast table when he came down reading a letter from the estate manager regarding the tenant situation in the North Quarter. 3 families in arrears. Boundary dispute brewing between the Harmon plot and the Cressley family. The usual tangle of things that landed inexplicably on her desk rather than Benjamin's, because she was the one who answered correspondence promptly, and Benjamin was the one who let it pile. She looked up when he entered. She said good morning. She passed him the bread basket. She did not look at him any differently than she had looked at him yesterday. That required everything she had. He sat. He poured his coffee. He watched her over the rim of his cup with that watchful look that meant he was trying to read the weather of her. "I've been corresponding with Mr. Dillard about the North Quarter tenants," keeping her eyes on the letter. "The Harmon boundary issue is more serious than he indicated last month. I'd like to ride out and speak with the families directly this week, if you have no objection. You shouldn't be riding in your condition. I'll take the carriage." She folded the letter and set it aside. "Also, I've written to Mr. Greer at the bank regarding the secondary accounts my uncle settled on me at the time of our marriage. I'd like a full accounting of those funds and what they've been generating." A pause. "Those accounts have always been," Benjamin began. "Mine," she said quietly. "Yes, they have always been mine. I'd like to know them better." He looked at her. She looked at him. Nothing in her expression gave him anything to work with. She had learned in her years at her uncle's house how to keep her face precisely blank when she needed to. "Is something wrong?" His voice had that careful quality again. Watchful. "No." She reached for her tea. "I simply think it's past time I understood my own affairs more fully. The baby changes things. I want to be sure I understand what's mine to protect." He didn't answer that. She didn't need him to. The Ashford estate accounts were a revelation. Not in the way of scandal. There was no theft, no reckless spending, no secret that leapt out at her from the ledger pages. What she found was more unsettling than that. What she found was evidence of her own work spread across years of entries without her name on a single one. She had been managing Ashford's household accounts since 6 months into their marriage, when it became clear that Benjamin's approach to bookkeeping was intermittent at best. She'd taken it on the way. She took on most things quietly, efficiently, because someone had to, and she was good at it. She hadn't thought about the fact that nothing in those ledgers indicated she'd done it. She spread the books out on the desk in her sitting room. Her own room, the one adjacent to the main bedroom that she'd quietly claimed as her workspace over the past year. And she went through them page by page with the methodical patience that had always been her great underestimated skill. The estate had been struggling when she married Benjamin. Not catastrophically, the Ashford name still held weight, and the land was good, but struggling in the particular quiet way that wealthy families struggled when they'd been living on reputation longer than income, when the habit of comfort had outlasted the means that built it. She had turned that around. It had taken 18 months of careful, unglamorous work. Renegotiating leases with the major tenants. Bringing in a more reliable mill operator for the Ashford grist mill. Convincing Benjamin to sell 2 unproductive parcels and reinvest in improvements to the main working land. Small decisions made quietly, implemented without fanfare, each one unremarkable alone and collectively transformative. She had saved this estate. She had done it while pregnant and without acknowledgement, and she had not thought to mind, because that was the deal she'd believed she'd made. The wife works. The husband holds the name. The name is his contribution. She sat in her sitting room in the afternoon light with the ledger books in front of her, and she thought about that deal for a long time. Then she picked up her pen, and she wrote to her solicitor. The weeks that followed were strange in the way that only a marriage in quiet crisis can be strange. From the outside to the staff, to the occasional caller, to Benjamin's mother, when she came for her weekly visit, everything looked perfectly ordinary. Abigail was gracious at the table. Abigail managed the household. Abigail walked in the gardens in the afternoons when the weather was mild and received callers on Tuesdays and Thursdays. What nobody noticed, because nobody had been paying close enough attention, was that Abigail was also having a series of very quiet, very purposeful conversations. With Mr. Greer at the bank, who was somewhat surprised by her detailed understanding of the accounts her uncle had settled on her, and more surprised by her specific questions about how they were structured. With Mr. Dillard, the estate manager, who found her questions about tenant leases and land valuations uncomfortably precise. With old Dr. Pruitt, who was not Benjamin's doctor, but her own, and who had been recommended by the Calloway girls, and who understood discretion in a way that Hargrove, who was also Benjamin's doctor, could not. And with Mrs. Ruth Caulfield, who was 63 years old and had been widowed twice, and who ran a small but profitable trading concern out of a building in town that most people in their circle had never looked at twice, and who had known Abigail's mother once long ago, and who had taken a quiet interest in Abigail, that Abigail was only now beginning to understand the value of. "You're thinking about it all wrong, child," Mrs. Caulfield told her one afternoon over tea in the back room of the trading concern, where the shelves were full of fabric bolts and account books in equal measure. "You keep asking what you're owed. Ask instead what you've built, because those aren't always the same thing." "And what have I built?" Abigail asked. The older woman tilted her head and looked at her with that particular measuring look that Abigail had come to respect. "A reputation for one. The people on that land of yours know your name better than they know his. The Harmon family. You sorted that boundary business yourself, didn't you? Without sending it through the lawyers. Old Thomas Harmon told my nephew. The Ashford wife came out personally and settled it in an afternoon over coffee and common sense. Abigail said nothing, but she felt something shift slightly in her chest. "That's worth more than you're counting it as," Mrs. Caulfield said. "Goodwill is capital, same as silver. You've got a good amount of it." She thought about that conversation for a long time afterward. She thought about what she had built. She thought about what she intended to build next. It was in the fourth week after the night in the hallway that Benjamin finally said something real. They were in the sitting room after dinner, one of the few evenings he'd actually remained in the house, rather than finding some reason to be elsewhere. And she was at her writing desk with correspondence, and he was at the window with his customary glass of bourbon, and his customary expression of a man being slowly strangled by his own thoughts. "Abigail." He said it to the window, not to her. "I need to speak with you about something." "Then speak," she said without looking up. A long pause. "Olivia Whitmore came to call this afternoon while you were at the Calloway sisters'." She wrote another line of her letter. Her hand was steady. "Did she?" "She wanted to—" He stopped. Started again. "She told me she's considering accepting an offer from James Pemberton, the younger one from Lynchburg." Abigail set down her pen. She turned around and looked at her husband. He was still facing the window. His profile showed her nothing that careful, handsome face that gave almost as little as hers did. The jaw that his grandmother's portrait shared. The slight tension at the back of his neck that she had learned to read as the external expression of an internal struggle he believed no one could see. "And how do you feel about that?" she asked. He turned then. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, or perhaps she had and hadn't known to name it. Something raw and slightly confused, like a man who has just discovered he is standing in a room he doesn't recognize. "I don't know." It was the most honest thing he'd said to her in months. She looked at him for a moment longer, then turned back to her letter. "I expect you'll figure it out," she said quietly. She heard him set down his glass. She heard him cross the room. He stopped behind her chair and stood there for a moment without speaking, and she could feel the weight of whatever he wanted to say pressing against the silence between them. "Are you, Abigail? Are you angry with me?" She paused. She considered her answer with the same care she brought to everything. "No, I'm not angry." She heard him exhale. "I am," she continued, "beginning to understand things I should have understood sooner. That's a different feeling entirely." Another silence. "What things?" he asked. She set down her pen. She turned in the chair and looked up at him. Her husband, this complicated, decent, ultimately limited man, she had married in good faith and loved more than she'd been wise to, and she told him the truth. "I'm beginning to understand what I am worth, Benjamin. Not to you, not to this family, to myself. I should have started much earlier." He opened his mouth. He closed it again, in the amber light of the sitting room, with his grandmother's ring. Back on Abigail's finger, she had put it on again after 3 days. Not for him, but because she'd decided she'd be the one to decide when to take it off, and it wouldn't be in a moment of pain. He looked at her as if she had said something in a language he was only now learning to hear. "What does that mean?" he asked. "What are you—" "It means that I am going to ensure this baby has a mother who knows her own value. And I'm going to start right now by finishing this letter, which is to my solicitor about the North Quarter leases. Good night, Benjamin." She turned back to her desk. He stood there a moment longer. Then very quietly, he left the room. She let out one long, slow breath and went back to work. By the time the dogwood was in bloom across the lower grounds of Ashford Manor, by the time the world outside had gone green and sweet-smelling in the way that Virginia always did in late April, as if it was making a promise it intended to keep Abigail Mercer, Ashford was not the same woman who had stood in the hallway with a candle and a shattered heart. She was not harder. That was important. She had been afraid in those first terrible weeks that what was happening to her was a kind of hardening, a calcification of something that had been soft and open, and she had watched herself carefully for the signs of it. But what was happening was the opposite of hardening. She was not closing. She was clarifying. She had always known she was capable. She had never quite known she had the right to act on that knowledge without permission. She had stopped waiting for permission. The estate accounts sat in her sitting room in two neat stacks, the original books and her own parallel records, which she had been keeping for the past 3 months, in a manner that was, if she was honest, considerably cleaner and more comprehensive than the originals. Mr. Dillard had begun in the past few weeks to send his reports directly to her without being asked. She had not pointed this out to Benjamin. She had written to her solicitor twice. He had written back both times with gratifying promptness, and she thought a certain quiet respect he had not bothered with in their earlier correspondence. She had visited the Harmon family again, and the Cressley family, and old Mrs. Pemberton, who farmed the southern edge of the estate, and who had been underpaying her lease by a small but consistent amount for 8 years, due to a clerical error that no one had bothered to correct. Abigail had corrected it gently with tea and an explanation, and Mrs. Pemberton had looked at her with a kind of grateful surprise that told Abigail no one had come out to speak to her personally in a very long time. She was building something. She could feel it taking shape around her. And somewhere in the great house behind her, her husband was beginning slowly to notice. The evening it became undeniable was a Thursday in late April. Benjamin had been in the study going over the quarterly returns, an activity that had in the past produced frustration and a general retreat to the bourbon decanter. That evening, Abigail had set her revised accounts next to his papers without comment and gone to sit in the garden. She heard him come to the study window above her. She didn't look up. She heard the window open. Abigail. His voice was strange, not cold, not warm, something she didn't have a word for yet. These figures, the North Quarter returns, how did you these are twice what Dillard projected? She looked up at him then. I renegotiated the Harmon lease, she said simply, and brought in a second tenant for the empty parcel by the creek. Young couple from Albemarle County. They're industrious. They'll do well. A silence. When did you do this? February and March mostly. He stared at her. You didn't... He stopped. I didn't know. No, she agreed. The light was going golden over the grounds. A mockingbird was singing somewhere in the dogwoods. She watched her husband's face in the window above her, and she felt something she had not expected to feel in that moment. Not triumph, not bitterness, but something quieter and more complicated. Grief, maybe. For all the time he hadn't looked. And underneath it, very steady, very certain her own. Come down to the garden, Benjamin. He came down to the garden. That was the thing Abigail hadn't fully predicted. Not that he would resist, but that he would simply obey. Benjamin Ashford, who had spent the better part of their marriage occupying the role of authority, without doing the work of it, came down the back steps of Ashford Manor and walked across the lawn toward her with the uncertain gait of a man who has just discovered that the ground beneath him has been shifting for months, and he is only now feeling it. She watched him come and kept her face composed. He sat in the chair across from hers without being invited to, which was the most natural thing he'd done in weeks. The couple from Albemarle. What are their names? Daniel and Margaret Holt. She's expecting her first child in July. He has a background in tobacco cultivation, which should serve us well if we convert the lower acreage the way Dillard's been resisting. Benjamin was quiet for a moment, turning that over. You've been thinking about converting the lower acreage. I've been thinking about it for 6 months. I spoke with 3 families in the area who've made the change successfully. The returns support it. You didn't mention it. You didn't ask. The words landed clean and without cruelty, and that was exactly how she'd meant them. She wasn't accusing him of anything he could defend himself against. She was simply stating a fact. He looked at her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, and the mockingbird went on singing somewhere in the dogwoods, like it had no interest in what happened to either of them. No, he said finally. I didn't. She nodded. She looked away. That was where they left it. But she felt something change in the air between them. Something small and significant. The way that hairline cracks in stone are small and significant. The kind you don't worry about until suddenly the whole wall has shifted. She went inside when the light failed. He stayed in the garden for a long time after. She didn't look back to see. What the people of Ashford Manor's surrounding county had always understood about Abigail Ashford, even before she understood it about herself, was that she was not decorative. This was in 1813, Virginia, not automatically a compliment. The world she moved through had very particular ideas about what a woman of her station was meant to be, and useful was not at the top of the list. Gracious was. Fertile was. Obedient to the social architecture that determined who sat where and who was introduced first, and who could reasonably pretend not to have noticed a slight without losing face. These were the currencies of her world, and she had been schooled in all of them by her uncle's household, with a thoroughness that left very little room for anything else. But Abigail had always done the math in her head during those lessons. She had sat through the instruction on proper forms of address and table precedence, and the subtle signals of a correctly managed social occasion, and she had absorbed it all completely, while simultaneously keeping a running account of which pieces of it were actually useful, and which were purely performative, and which were strategic in ways that most people were too comfortable to notice. Mrs. Calloway, who had known her since girlhood, once said that Abigail Mercer had a mind like a well-kept ledger. Everything in its column, nothing wasted, always balanced at the end of the day. The county was beginning to discover what that meant when the ledger was being kept on their behalf. The Harmon business had gotten around. Word traveled in the way that it always did in close counties, not through direct speech, which would require people to admit they were talking about someone's private affairs, but through the gradual accumulation of knowing looks and dropped references and comments made just loudly enough to be overheard in the right rooms. What people were saying beneath all the diplomatic phrasing was that the Ashford wife had ridden out to the Harmon land and sorted out in one afternoon what 3 rounds of legal correspondence hadn't managed in 2 years. This was not a small thing. The Harmon boundary dispute had been a low-grade crisis for half the county because the Harmon land abutted 4 other properties, and what happened there had implications for everyone. The lawyers had been going around in circles. 2 families had stopped speaking. Thomas Harmon himself had started carrying a look on his face, like a man who'd given up expecting anything good from anyone. Abigail had gone out on a Wednesday morning with a cold March wind cutting across the fields, and she'd sat with Thomas Harmon and his neighbor James Cressley at Harmon's kitchen table, and she'd looked at the original land grant documents. The actual documents, not the copies that had been reproduced incorrectly back in 1798, and that had been the source of the entire confusion, and she'd shown them where the error was. Not dramatically. Not with legal language or formal procedure. She'd simply set the documents side by side and pointed with one finger and said, "There, you see where the creek marker was recorded twice. That's where it went wrong." And Thomas Harmon had leaned in and squinted and said, "Lord in heaven, that's it, isn't it?" And James Cressley had said something considerably more profane that she'd chosen not to hear, and then apologized, and she'd told him no apology was necessary because she was inclined to agree with the sentiment. They'd redrawn the boundary that afternoon with a mutual handshake and a shared supper that Mrs. Harmon had clearly been planning to withhold from her husband until the mood improved. By the time Abigail drove the carriage back to Ashford Manor, Thomas Harmon had told her 3 times that she was the most sensible person who'd set foot on his land in living memory. She'd told him she appreciated the sentiment, and she hoped he'd remember it if she ever needed a good word spoken in her direction. He'd laughed. He hadn't known she was entirely serious. By May, there was a particular look that Benjamin had taken to wearing in the mornings. She noticed it at breakfast, where their exchanges had become something she would have called polite if pressed, though there was a quality beneath the politeness that didn't quite fit that word. He watched her in a different way now. Not the vague awareness of a man who knows his wife is somewhere in the house, the kind of noticing that treats a person as furniture, as background, as part of the expected landscape. Something more specific had crept into his attention. Something that looked disconcertingly like he was trying to work something out. She didn't ask him what. She was not in the business of making things easier for him right now. On a morning in the 2nd week of May, when the post arrived, and she sorted through it efficiently at the breakfast table, the way she always did. Estate correspondence to the left. Personal letters to the right, bills, to be routed to the accounts she now managed. Directly in the middle, she found a letter from a man named Elias Greer, second cousin, to the banker who was writing on behalf of a consortium of landowners in the next county, looking to negotiate a shared arrangement for milling grain. She read it twice. Then she set it next to her teacup and went on eating. Benjamin across the table watched her put it down. "What is that?" "A business proposition. I'll need to think on it." "From whom?" "A Mr. Greer, representing several landowners in Fauquier County." She picked up her tea. "They're interested in a shared milling arrangement using the Ashford mill. If the terms are right, it could increase the mill's operating income by a third." The silence from his side of the table had a particular quality. Not hostile, not displeased, something she couldn't quite categorize. "Abigail." He set down his fork. I mean to say, that's Ashford business. A decision like that isn't—" She looked at him. Not coldly, not with the frozen courtesy she was capable of when she needed to be. She looked at him with perfect directness and a patience that was just barely running thin. "It is Ashford business," she agreed. "And I am an Ashford. I'll consult Mr. Dillard before I respond. If you have concerns about the arrangement, I'm happy to discuss them." "Was there something specific you wanted to say?" He had things he wanted to say. She could see them crowding behind his expression like people at a door. But he picked up his fork again. "No, just keep me informed." "Of course," she said pleasantly, and went back to her correspondence. Her heart was beating harder than she was letting on. That was all right. Hearts were allowed to do that as long as hands stayed steady. She was 6 weeks from her confinement when Olivia Whitmore came to call. Abigail had known it was coming. She had not known exactly when, but she'd felt the inevitability of it, the way you feel weather before it arrives, a particular quality in the atmosphere, a shift in pressure. Olivia was not a woman who left loose ends, and whatever had passed between her and Benjamin in the study that night in February was in Olivia's accounting a loose end. She arrived on a Tuesday, which was one of Abigail's formal receiving days, which meant Abigail had no grounds to be unavailable, and Olivia knew it. She was beautiful as she always was. Dark-haired and fine-featured with the effortless composure of a woman who had never needed to work at appearing confident because she simply was. She came into the sitting room in a deep green traveling dress, and she sat in the chair across from Abigail and accepted tea and complimented the arrangement of the room with the kind of graciousness that is indistinguishable from condescension if you're not paying close attention. Abigail was always paying close attention. "You look well," Olivia said. And then, with a glance at Abigail's figure, visible now unmistakable, considering. "I am well, thank you." Abigail poured her own tea with a steady hand. "What brings you to Ashford, Olivia?" A small pause. Olivia turned her teacup slightly on its saucer. "I wanted to see you. I've been remiss in calling. Have been matters to attend to at Whitmore." "Of course." Abigail waited. Olivia looked at her. There was something behind the dark eyes that Abigail had not expected to find there, something that looked, if she read it correctly, like discomfort. Not guilt exactly, but its well-dressed cousin. "I understand you've been very active in managing the estate," Olivia said, choosing her words. "People speak of it. Thomas Harmon particularly." "Thomas Harmon is very kind. He told my father you were the most capable woman he'd met since his grandmother." A brief pause. "His grandmother ran a trading post in the mountains for 30 years. Abigail allowed herself a small smile. "I'll take that." Olivia set down her teacup. She looked at Abigail with that dark, direct gaze and said with a precision that Abigail could only respect, even under the circumstances, "I came to tell you I'm accepting James Pemberton's offer." The room was very quiet. "He's asked twice," Olivia continued. "He's a decent man. The Pemberton family is solid. I believe it is the right decision." Abigail looked at her. There was something she needed to understand about Olivia Whitmore in this moment, and she needed to understand it correctly, because the wrong reading would lead her somewhere she didn't want to go. She looked at this woman who had been in a half-open study door on a February night and said things that had cracked Abigail's world open, and she tried to see her clearly. What she saw was a woman who had been in love with a man who had chosen someone else, and who had not handled that gracefully, but who was now perhaps beginning to. "Why are you telling me?" Abigail asked quietly. Olivia was still for a moment. "Because you deserve to know. And because I am not proud of all the choices I've made, where Benjamin is concerned." She said his name carefully, as if aware of its weight in this room. "I thought you should hear it from me directly." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate that," she said finally, and she meant it more than she expected to. Olivia left 30 minutes later. She did not stay for a second cup. At the door she paused and turned and looked at Abigail one last time. "You're a remarkable woman, Abigail. You always were." She said it without softness and without resentment, and therefore it landed as truth, which was the most disconcerting thing she could have done. After the door closed, Abigail stood in the hallway for a long moment. Then she went to find Benjamin. How was in the stable? Not because he had anywhere to go, his horse was already unsaddled, but because Benjamin had always found physical spaces easier than emotional ones. And right now she suspected he needed the company of animals and the smell of hay, and something to do with his hands that wasn't complicated by the weight of what he knew and didn't know and was beginning to suspect. She stood at the entrance to the stable, and she said his name. He turned. He had clearly heard Olivia's carriage arrive. She could see it in his face, the careful stillness of a man who has spent 2 hours deciding what to feel and has arrived at no conclusion. He looked at Abigail with an expression that was raw in a way she hadn't seen from him before, like something had given way. "She came?" "Yes." "To tell you about Pemberton?" "Yes." He turned away. His hand rested on the stall gate. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight bow of his head. "Are you?" he started. "I'm fine." "You keep saying that." "Because I keep meaning it." She came further into the stable and stood close enough that he'd need to look at her if he turned. "Benjamin, I need to ask you something and I need you to answer me honestly." He turned. She looked at him straight. "That night in February, when Olivia was here." She watched his face go very still. "I was in the hallway. I heard what you said." The silence was absolute. His face did something she couldn't fully describe, a kind of collapse and reconstruction happening at the same time, the way a man looks when something he's been bracing against has finally arrived, and the bracing turns out to have been exhausting. "Abigail, let me finish." Her voice was steady. "I heard you. I heard everything. And I want you to know that I am not telling you this to punish you or to have a scene. I'm telling you because I have been making decisions based on it for 3 months, and you have a right to know why I've changed." He stared at her. "You've known." Not a question. The words barely had sound. "Since February." The silence stretched out like something physical. "I didn't." He stopped. Started again. "What I said that night, Abigail. It was, I was saying something I believed once. Something I'd told myself for a long time, because it was easier then." "Then what?" He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on Benjamin Ashford in 2 years and 3 months of marriage. Exposed. Uncertain. Like a man standing in an open field with no cover in sight. "Then understanding what I have. What I was given. What I've been." The word seemed to cost him something. "What I've been too blind to see." She held his gaze. "That's a beginning," she said quietly. "It's not enough, but it's a beginning." She left him there. She walked back to the house with her hand on her abdomen and the afternoon light warm on her face, and she thought about what enough would look like. She didn't have the answer yet, but she was getting closer. The letter from the Greer Consortium arrived with a counter-proposal in the 3rd week of May, and Abigail spent 2 days reviewing it line by line before she drafted her response. The terms they were offering were reasonable, more than reasonable. But there was a clause in the middle of page 3 regarding mill maintenance costs that she didn't like the language of, and she marked it and wrote her counter clearly and sent it back with Mr. Dillard's signature and her own notation in the margin. The response from the consortium came back within the week. They accepted her terms. She sat with that letter in her hands for a long moment. Then she went to tell Benjamin. He was in the study going over accounts. The accounts she had reorganized that now made sense in a way they hadn't before. He looked up when she came in. She handed him the letter without comment. He read it. He read it again. Then he set it down on the desk and looked at his wife standing across from him with her hands folded over the swell of her pregnancy, and a composure that he was beginning to understand was not coldness, but something infinitely more formidable than coldness. "You negotiated this?" "Yes." "The maintenance clause?" "It was loose. I tightened it." He looked at the letter again, then at her, then back at the letter with the expression of a man who has just realized he has been reading a document upside down for a very long time. Abigail. He said her name differently than he used to, more carefully, more weight behind it. "How long have you been doing this, all of it? The accounts, the tenants, how long?" She considered the question. 18 months. Perhaps 20. He was quiet for a long time. "I didn't know." "No. You didn't." She watched him struggle with that. It was not a comfortable thing to watch a decent man confronting the dimensions of his own blindness. She did not enjoy it, but she did not look away from it either. "I owe you," he began. "You don't owe me anything." Her voice was very calm. "That's not what this is. I did what needed doing because it needed doing. I'm not keeping a ledger of debts, Benjamin. What I am doing is deciding who I want to be going forward. For myself. For this baby. And if you intend to be part of that, really part of it, then you need to start seeing me. Not as a wife, not as a function. As a person who has been here doing the work this whole time." He stood up from behind the desk. He walked around it and stopped in front of her, and he looked at her with those watchful gray eyes, and for a moment she could see him clearly. All of him. The man she'd married, and the man he'd failed to be, and the man he might yet become, and it was one of the most complicated things she'd ever had to hold. "I see you," he said quietly. "I think I'm starting to." She looked back at him. "Start faster," and walked away. The turning point that nobody saw coming happened on a Saturday afternoon in early June at a gathering hosted by the Calloway family, which was the kind of social occasion that the county used to conduct its real business under the cover of pleasantries. The Calloway patriarch, Robert Calloway Sr., had invited several of the county's significant landowners to discuss a matter that had been brewing for months, a challenge to the Ashford Estate's grazing rights on the shared eastern meadow that bordered 4 properties brought forward by a man named Rutherford Doyle, who had bought the Eastland property 2 years ago, and who had spent those 2 years systematically testing every boundary he shared with his neighbors. Doyle's argument was technical and on the surface plausible. He had a surveyor. He had documents. He had the kind of confident precision that comes from having paid good money for an argument and intending to get his money's worth. What he had not anticipated was Abigail. She had not expected to be involved. She had come to the Calloway gathering because the invitation had included her by name alongside Benjamin, and she had learned not to interpret this as unusual anymore. She sat beside her husband in the Calloway drawing room, and she listened to Rutherford Doyle make his case with the pleasant attention of a woman who appears to be thinking about something else entirely. She was not thinking about something else. She was thinking about the original Ashford land grant of 1794, which she had read 3 times in the course of reviewing the estate's historical documents, and which contained a specific clause about the eastern meadow grazing rights that Doyle's surveyor had apparently not accounted for because it was located not in the main grant document, but in an addendum filed separately with the county clerk in 1796 and not cross-referenced in the standard records. She had found it in February, while going through the estate documents, the same thorough way she went through everything. She had not known then that she would need it. She waited until Doyle finished. She waited while Robert Calloway and 2 other landowners weighed in with their concerns and their suggestions and their general anxiety about the precedent being set. She waited while Benjamin sat beside her with the particular rigidity of a man who knows he's about to lose something and doesn't know how to stop it. "Mr. Calloway, if I may." Robert Calloway, who had known her since she was Abigail Mercer, and who had a great deal of respect for her uncle and considerably more respect for her, turned immediately. "Mrs. Ashford, Mr. Doyle's surveyor has done thorough work," she said pleasantly. "I don't dispute his measurements. I do dispute their relevance given the addendum to the Ashford land grant filed with the county clerk in March of 1796, which established the grazing rights on the eastern meadow as an easement in perpetuity, separate from and superseding any future property boundary adjustments. She looked at Rutherford Doyle across the room. "I have a copy in my correspondence bag if anyone would like to review it." The room was very quiet. Doyle's confident expression had developed a crack. "I'm not aware of any such addendum." "Most people aren't," she agreed. "It's filed separately. The cross-reference was never added to the main record, which is a clerical oversight I intend to correct with the county office next week. Mr. Calloway, would you like to see the document?" She produced it. She had carried it in her bag since the invitation to this gathering had arrived, because she had learned to carry the things she might need. Robert Calloway read it. He passed it to the man beside him. It made its way around the room. When it reached Rutherford Doyle, he read it for a very long time. Then he set it down on the table. "Well," he said with the resignation of a man who recognizes he has been outmaneuvered completely and has the grace to know it. "That does appear to settle the matter." Benjamin beside her had not moved. She didn't look at him. She thanked Robert Calloway and accepted the document back when it was returned to her and tucked it neatly back into her correspondence bag and resumed the position of a woman who has just handled a mild administrative matter and would now like to go back to the refreshment table. In the carriage going home, Benjamin didn't speak for a long time. She waited. "How long have you had that document?" he asked finally. "Since February." "And you just carried it, all this time, in case. A woman who doesn't carry what she needs is a woman who depends on luck." She looked out the carriage window at the evening fields going gold. "I prefer preparation." He was quiet again. When he spoke, his voice was different, lower, something in it she hadn't heard before. "You saved the Eastern Meadow." "Yes." "If Doyle had prevailed, we would have lost the grazing rights and a third of the summer revenue, and the precedent would have encouraged him to challenge 3 other boundaries within the year." "I know." He turned to look at her. "Abigail." Just her name. But the way he said it this time was not the careful, habitual, polite way. It was the way you say someone's name when you've been looking at a painting for a long time and have suddenly understood what it is actually of. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't thank me for this. Don't make it into something you owe me. Just remember it. Remember that I was there. Remember what I did." She looked at him then. "And ask yourself whether you would have known to look for that document, whether you've ever given me reason to believe you knew it needed looking for." He held her gaze. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The carriage rolled on through the golden evening, and the Ashford estate came into view at the end of the lane, its windows catching the last of the light, its grounds green and well-tended, its accounts balanced, its tenants spoken to, its boundaries quietly and thoroughly protected. And Abigail Mercer Ashford looked at it and felt for the first time that she was not simply living inside someone else's story. She was building her own. And it was only just beginning. The baby came on a Tuesday, not in July, the way Dr. Pruitt had projected, but in the last week of June, which meant Abigail had approximately 6 hours of warning, and precisely none of the ceremonial preparation she'd been told to expect from women who'd done this before. Mrs. Calloway had told her labor was long. Mrs. Caulfield had told her it was unpredictable. Her own mother, in the one conversation Abigail could still half remember from childhood, had told her it was the most alone you could feel while surrounded by people. Her mother had been right about that last part. Benjamin was in the East Wing when it started. She sent Hannah, the upstairs maid, to fetch him, and then she sent for Dr. Pruitt, and then she lay down on the bed in the room that was hers, not the shared room, her own sitting room that she'd furnished and claimed and made into something that belonged to her, and she breathed through the first wave of it with her teeth set, and her hands flat on the mattress, and her mind working through the arithmetic of the situation, the way it always worked through difficult things. One at a time. What she could control, and what she couldn't. Benjamin appeared in the doorway within 2 minutes. He looked at her face and went pale. "Pruitt is coming," before he could speak. "The baby is early. I need you to be calm." "I am calm," in the voice of a man who absolutely was not. "You're the color of old plaster, Benjamin. Sit down or leave the room. One or the other." He stayed. He sat in the chair beside her bed, and he was not calm, but he was present, which was the thing she actually needed, and which he managed without her having to ask again. The labor lasted 9 hours. He did not leave once. She didn't know until it was over, until the room had been cleaned and Dr. Pruitt had gone, and she was holding a small, red-faced, alarmingly determined-looking boy against her chest. She didn't know until that moment how much she'd needed him to stay. She didn't say it, but she held on to it. The baby was named James after her father. Benjamin had offered no objection. She hadn't asked for one. He'd stood at the foot of the bed and looked at his child, with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Something that was beyond language. Something that rewired a person permanently. And she'd watched him experience it, and she'd thought, whatever else this is, whatever else we are to each other, this part is real. James Ashford came into the world on a Tuesday, 6 weeks early, and in a determined hurry, and he changed everything, not all at once, and not in any of the ways Abigail had anticipated. The thing about a baby, she discovered quickly, was that it removed all the space a marriage had been using for avoidance. There was no more retreating to separate wings. No more dinners where they were polite to each other across a table long enough that politeness was easy. No more of the careful distance they'd been maintaining since the night in February, like two people sharing a road and walking carefully on opposite edges. James didn't care about their arrangement. James cared about being fed and held, and about a particular way of being rocked that he had very strong opinions on for someone who had existed for less than a week. She was nursing him in the sitting room on the 4th night when Benjamin appeared in the doorway at 2 in the morning, fully dressed, which told her he hadn't slept either. "I heard him. He's settled. You didn't need to come." He came in anyway. Sat in the chair across from her. Watched the baby with that expression he'd developed, the one that belonged only to James, and that she thought might be the most unguarded she'd ever seen him. "He looks like your father," he said quietly. "In the miniature you keep, around the eyes." She looked up. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't known he'd ever looked at the miniature of her father closely enough to remember it. "He does." The silence between them was different at 2 in the morning, with a week-old baby between them. Less defended. Like the dark had filed the edges off something. "I've been thinking." Benjamin started, and then stopped. Started again. "I've been thinking about what you said, in the stable, about being seen." He looked at his hands for a moment. "I've been thinking about it every day since." She waited. "I don't think I knew," he said slowly, "how much I was taking from you, how much you were giving that I never even looked at. I thought—" He stopped. "I thought being a decent man was the same as being a good husband. I thought if I wasn't cruel, if I wasn't dishonest, if I kept the obligations." "Obligations aren't love," she said quietly. "No." The word landed like he'd known it was coming and had been dreading it. "No, they aren't." James made a small sound, and she adjusted him, and for a moment the only thing in the room was the small business of a new life making its demands. "I need to ask you something," Benjamin said, "and I need you to answer me honestly, even if the honest answer is the one I deserve." She looked at him. "Did you ever love me?" he asked. "The way I should have wanted to be loved by you? Did it exist at any point? Or was I always just—" "An obligation," she finished. He held her gaze. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, looking down at the baby in her arms. This small new weight that was Benjamin's and hers, and belonged to neither of them in any way either of them could fully control. "I loved you. I loved you from fairly early on, and I spent a long time pouring that love into the cracks of a marriage that had no foundation except goodwill and mutual respect, and I told myself it was enough because I didn't know what else to do with it." She looked up. "And then I heard you through a door, and I understood that I had been filling a space that was never shaped for me, that you had made room for me because you needed a wife, not because you'd chosen me." Benjamin was very still. "I've been asking myself a question for 4 months now. Not whether you love me. I think in your way you do. I'm asking whether you would choose me. Whether if you were standing at the beginning of this at the chapel in Charlottesville, knowing everything you know, now you would choose me. Not because of the baby, Not because of what I've built for this estate, but because of me, Abigail. Because you want the life we could actually have." He opened his mouth. "Don't answer now. Think about it. Genuinely think about it. Because if the answer is yes, I need it to be true. And if it isn't, I need to know that too." She looked back down at James. Benjamin sat across from her for a long time. Then he stood very quietly, and before he left the room, he did something she didn't expect. He came to where she sat, and he laid his hand very gently on the top of James's head. Barely a touch, just a warmth, and then he walked out. She held on to that too. What happened in the 6 weeks following James's birth remade something between them in ways that neither of them had named yet. Benjamin began getting up in the night when the baby cried, even when she'd already heard him and was on her way. He began appearing in the kitchen in the early mornings when she was eating breakfast before the house was properly awake and sitting across from her, not to conduct business or discuss accounts, but simply to be there. He began small things, unremarkable things that added up. He asked Hannah to bring Abigail's afternoon tea to the sitting room where she worked, rather than to the drawing room where propriety said she ought to be. He told Mr. Dillard directly that all estate matters should be cleared with Mrs. Ashford before being brought to him. He said it plainly in front of 2 tenant men who were standing in the yard, and then he didn't make anything of it. She noticed all of it. She didn't say anything. She was waiting to see if it held when it became inconvenient. That test came sooner than she expected, and from a direction she hadn't anticipated. Miriam Ashford arrived on a Wednesday in the 2nd week of July. Benjamin's mother was a woman of precise and formidable quality, the kind of woman who had been beautiful when young and had converted that beauty upon aging into a relentless social competence that was almost more powerful. She loved her son with the fierce proprietary love of a woman who had raised him alone after her husband's death, and who had never quite been able to separate her love for him from her sense of ownership over his choices. She had been civil to Abigail since the wedding. Civil in the way that means I have assessed you and found you adequate, which is not quite the same as welcome. She came to see the baby, which was the stated reason, and she held James with genuine warmth and called him a fine boy and meant it. Then she handed him to Hannah and sat down with Abigail in the sitting room and proceeded to have the conversation she'd actually come to have. "I've been hearing things," Miriam said, not unkindly, but with that particular quality she had where every sentence felt like the opening move of a chess game. "About your management of the estate, the tenant business, the Callaway gathering." "People are generous," Abigail said. "People are impressed." Miriam looked at her steadily. "Which creates a complication." Abigail waited. "You understand, Abigail, how this looks to the county. A wife managing her husband's business affairs, corresponding directly with solicitors and bankers, attending a legal dispute and speaking for the estate without what?" Abigail's voice was even. Miriam paused as if measuring how direct to be. "Without being asked to," she finished. The sitting room was very quiet. "I was asked to," Abigail said. "By necessity. Because the work needed doing, and no one else was doing it." She set down her teacup with a steadiness that cost her something. "Mrs. Ashford, I respect you, and I am glad you are here to see your grandson. I am also going to say something to you plainly, because I think you are a plain enough woman to appreciate it. I saved this estate, not by accident, and not by overstepping, by doing the work that was in front of me. If that creates a complication for how the county discusses the Ashford family, I am genuinely sorry, but I will not undo it." Miriam looked at her. For a long, still moment, nothing moved. Then something shifted in Miriam Ashford's expression. Something that Abigail would not have expected, that she almost didn't catch, something that looked briefly and remarkably like satisfaction. "No," Miriam said. "I don't suppose you will." She reached for her own tea. "Good." Abigail blinked. Miriam looked at her over the rim of her cup with an expression that contained multitudes. "Did you think I came here to tell you to stop?" she asked quietly. "Abigail, I spent 30 years managing this estate, quietly in the way women of my generation had to, in ways my husband never once thought to notice." Something crossed her face, old, specific, recognizable. "I know exactly what you've been doing. I came to make sure you intended to keep doing it." The silence between them was completely different from what it had been a moment ago. "And to tell you," Miriam continued, setting down her cup, "that whatever has been going on between you and Benjamin and I am not asking because it's none of my concern. I want you to know that I am not on the other side of it." She met Abigail's eyes. "I should have said that sooner. I'm saying it now." Abigail held her gaze. "Thank you," she managed. It was the most genuine thing she'd said in weeks. It was Benjamin's sister who forced the confrontation that had been building for months. Eleanor Ashford was 24 and unmarried and sharp in the way that women who were too intelligent for their circumstances tended to be, all of it compressed into observations and comments that she released with the precision of someone who had learned that the only power available to her was the power of seeing things correctly and saying them at the wrong moment. She came with Miriam and stayed 3 days. On the second evening at dinner, she looked across the table at her brother and said in the cheerful tone she used for things that weren't cheerful at all, "Benjamin, did you know that Thomas Harmon's son told everyone in the county that your wife is the finest mind on the Eastern Ridge?" Benjamin, who had been reaching for his glass, paused. "The Eastern Ridge includes the Callaway land and the Pemberton holdings." Eleanor continued as if explaining geography. "So what he's actually saying is that your wife is the finest mind in the entire county as far as any sensible person is concerned." She picked up her fork. "I thought you should know, in case you didn't." "Eleanor," Miriam said, "I'm just sharing county news, mother." Benjamin set down his glass. He looked at Eleanor with an expression Abigail recognized, the one he used when he was being warned about something he already knew and didn't want to be warned about publicly. "I'm aware," he said. "Are you?" Eleanor tilted her head. "Because I also heard from the Callaway girls that Mr. Greer's consortium told Robert Callaway Sr. that they've never had a negotiation conducted with more clarity or efficiency, and they'd like to expand the milling arrangement next season." Directly to Abigail. They wrote to her. She looked at her sister-in-law. "Which you may already know." Abigail kept her face perfectly composed. She had in fact received that letter 2 days ago. "The point," Eleanor said, turning back to her brother with an evenness that was somehow worse than an accusation, "is that the county is talking about your wife Benjamin in ways they've never talked about you. And I think you should know what they're saying, because I think you should be asking yourself whether you deserve her." Dead silence. Miriam closed her eyes briefly. Benjamin put both hands flat on the table. "Eleanor." His voice was very quiet. "I'm serious," his sister said, not with cruelty, with something that was almost gentle, which made it land harder. "I love you, you know I do. But I've been watching you for 2 days, and I need you to understand what you have in this woman, because I don't think you do. Not fully. Not yet." Abigail was looking at the tablecloth. She felt Benjamin's gaze move to her. "I know." And then he said it again, quieter. "I know." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her fork and went back to her dinner. "Good. Then act like it." The Rutherford Doyle situation refused to stay settled. That was the thing about men like Doyle. They didn't accept outcomes. They reassessed tactics. He had been outmaneuvered at the Callaway gathering, and he had by all appearances accepted it with grace. And then he had spent 6 weeks finding a different angle. He found it through a junior partner at the law firm in Charlottesville, who had access to a particular set of county records from the 1790s, and who was, it transpired, susceptible to financial persuasion. The junior partner produced a document, a surveyor's amendment dated 1797, that appeared to postdate the Ashford addendum and to supersede it. Abigail heard about it on a Thursday morning from Mr. Dillard, who came to the house with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man delivering terrible news. "Doyle's filed with the county clerk. His solicitor is claiming the amendment invalidates the easement. They're requesting a formal hearing in 3 weeks." She set down the account book she'd been reviewing. "Show me the document." "Ma'am." "The surveyor's amendment. Has Doyle's solicitor produced the original or only a copy?" Dillard blinked. A copy, I believe, ma'am. Filed with the clerk." "Then I want to see the original." She stood up. Where does the county keep the surveyor's records from the 1790s? The records office in Charlottesville. But ma'am, the hearing is in 3 weeks. We'd need to... I know how much time we have. Get the carriage. Benjamin appeared in the doorway, at that moment, having heard voices. He looked at Dillard, then at Abigail, reading the room with the quickness he'd developed over the past 2 months. What's happened? She told him. Cleanly and under a minute. He was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. I'll come with you. You don't need to be, Abigail. Direct, certain, no negotiation in it. I'm coming. She looked at him. Something settled slightly in her chest. She didn't examine it right then. Get your coat. The records office in Charlottesville was managed by a man named August Pell, who was 61 and had the slightly defeated air of someone who had spent 4 decades in the company of documents that no one valued until suddenly they did. He led them to the surveyor's archive with minimal ceremony and the quiet efficiency of a man who respected people who came with specific questions. Abigail found it in 40 minutes. The original Surveyor's Amendment. Filed March 14, 1797. She set it next to the copy that Doyle's solicitor had submitted to the clerk's office. She looked at them side by side in the thin light of the archive room with Benjamin standing at her shoulder. She found the discrepancy in the 3rd paragraph. There, she said quietly. Benjamin leaned in. The date on the copy read March 14, 1797. The date on the original read March 14, 1799. 2 years later, which put it after an entirely separate land grant had been issued, one that, if Abigail's memory of the estate documents was correct, had already established the easement as legally permanent and immune to subsequent amendment. The copy has been altered. The words fell into the archive room like stones into still water. Are you certain? Benjamin's voice was careful. Look at the ink on the date. On the original, the 7 is written exactly like the 7 in the paragraph below it. On the copy, it's different. Someone changed the 9 to a 7. She looked up. Doyle's solicitor submitted a falsified document to the county clerk. Silence. Benjamin straightened up. She could feel the shift in him, not toward panic, but toward something harder, something that settled into purpose. What do we do? He asked. She looked at him. Something struck her about the question the way he'd asked it. Not what do you do? Not let me handle this now. What do we do? Like the word had become natural without him noticing. We take the original. We present it to the hearing, and we report the falsification to the county judge separately before Doyle has a chance to realize we've found it. How quickly can we see the judge? Today. If we go now. He held out his hand, not to take charge, not to lead her somewhere she wasn't already going. He held out his hand, and the way a person does when they want to walk alongside someone, when they understand the road belongs to both of them. She looked at his hand. Then she took it. They walked out of the archive together, and the document was under her arm, and she did not let herself think too much about the warmth of his hand around hers, because there were more important things to attend to right now, and she had always been good at focusing on the most important thing. They were seen by Judge Harlan Price that afternoon. Abigail presented the original and the copy side by side. She explained the discrepancy clearly and without drama, the way she would explain an entry in a ledger. Here is the number. Here is why it doesn't match. Here is what that means. Judge Price looked at the documents for a long time. Then he looked at Abigail. Mrs. Ashford, he said slowly, how did you come to have access to the original surveyor's records? I went and looked at them, she said simply. He looked at Benjamin. Benjamin looked back with an expression that said very plainly, she is not a woman. You ask that question too, with any expectation of a different answer. Price actually smiled very briefly. The hearing will be dismissed. And I'll be sending a notice to Doyle's solicitor regarding the filing of falsified documents. That's a serious matter. He set the papers down. Mrs. Ashford, I've been on this bench for 19 years. I've had maybe 3 cases in that time where someone came in with this level of preparation. He paused. You're a credit to your family. Abigail looked at him steadily. "Thank you, Judge Price." And then very quietly, without looking at Benjamin, "I believe I'm becoming one." In the carriage, going home, the light was going orange over the hills, and James would be wanting his evening feeding, and Hannah would be managing with the competence Hannah always managed with, and there was nothing pressing for the next hour except the road and the fading day and the silence between them. Benjamin broke it. "When I said what I said, to Olivia." He was looking straight ahead, not at her. "That night in February. I need you to know what I meant by it. What I was actually saying." She looked at her hands. "I'd been telling myself a story for a long time. That I'd chosen duty over feeling. That there was something noble about it. That the wanting a different life was that it was a real thing, something I'd actually lost." He turned then, looked at her with an honesty that was clearly costing him. "But I hadn't lost anything. I'd just never looked at what I had. I'd been grieving a story I'd made up while the real thing was right in front of me, and I was I don't know, too afraid, too blind. Both." She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to forgive that," he continued. "I'm not sure it deserves forgiveness. I'm telling you because I think you've spent 4 months wondering what you were to me. And the answer is—" He stopped, steadied. "The answer is that you are the most remarkable person I have ever known. And I failed to see it for 2 years, and I'm not going to spend the rest of my life making that mistake." Abigail was quiet. The carriage rolled on. "You told me to think about it. Whether I would choose you, at the chapel, knowing what I know now." He held her gaze. "I would. Without question. Without hesitation. Not because of James. Not because of the estate. Because of who you are. Abigail. Just her name, but different from every other time. I would choose you." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about everything she'd carried for 4 months. The ring she'd taken off and put back on, the ledgers and the letters and the archive rooms and the hearings, the choices she'd made without asking permission, the woman she'd become in the making of them. She thought about what she'd told him in the stable that was a beginning, but it isn't enough. She looked at him now. This man who had hurt her without meaning to, and who was not a villain and not a hero, but something much harder to manage, a person who was capable of better and was finally doing the work of it, and she thought about enough. "I believe you," she said quietly. He looked at her, waited. "I believe you," she repeated. "I'm not ready to tell you it fixes it, but I believe you mean it, and that matters." She looked back at the road ahead. "That matters quite a lot." He didn't reach for her hand. He understood she thought that she hadn't arrived yet, that there was still a distance to cover, but he'd stopped looking away. And somewhere in the understanding of that, somewhere in the knowledge that he was finally, fully, irreversibly looking at her, Abigail Mercer. Ashford felt the first small movement of something that had been frozen since February. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the ground shifting beneath it, the way ground shifts before things begin to grow. The ground that had shifted in the carriage did not produce anything overnight. Abigail had not expected it to. She was too honest with herself for that kind of wishful arithmetic, the kind that takes one true moment and builds a future on it before the foundation has been tested. She had spent 2 months learning the difference between what a person said and what a person did, and she was not going to unlearn that lesson, because Benjamin Ashford had finally looked at her the way she'd needed him to look at her for 2 years. She would wait for the doing. And the doing, to his credit, began. It began in small ways that she catalogued without comment, the way she catalogued everything. Not to build a case, but because detail was how she understood the world, and she had decided she was going to understand this one clearly before she made any decisions about it. He began coming to the estate meetings with Dillard. Not to take over, she noticed that he was careful about that. Careful in a way that told her he'd thought about it deliberately, but to sit beside her and listen and ask questions afterward, rather than before. The first time he did it, Dillard looked between them with the expression of a man recalculating the situation he was in. The second time, Dillard addressed his primary remarks to Abigail as a matter of course, and directed supplementary questions to Benjamin, and nobody commented on the order of it. He began eating breakfast with her consistently. Not the half-present newspaper and coffee version of breakfast they'd conducted for months, but actual breakfast where he stayed at the table and they talked about James, or the accounts, or the letter she'd received from the Greer Consortium, or occasionally nothing in particular. Talking about nothing in particular was she had always believed the real measure of whether two people were comfortable together. It was easy to fill silence with business. It was harder to simply occupy the same space without agenda. They were not comfortable yet, but they were trying. James, for his part, was completely indifferent to all of it. He was 6 weeks old, and his concerns were immediate and non-negotiable, and centered on 3 square feet of the world at any given time, and Abigail found a particular relief in that. The baby did not care about February, or Olivia Whitmore, or the gap between what Benjamin had said in the study and what he was trying to build now. James cared about being held, and the rest of it could sort itself out. It was good, she thought, to be in the presence of someone whose needs were that clear. The letter from Rutherford Doyle arrived on a Monday. Not from his solicitor. That avenue had been closed when Judge Price sent his notice, and the solicitor had apparently distanced himself from Doyle with considerable speed once the falsification charge was on record. This letter was from Doyle himself, handwritten on expensive paper, in the handwriting of a man who was accustomed to having things come out the way he wanted, and was adjusting to a new reality. Howe was not apologizing. Men like Doyle did not apologize. What he was doing was a more careful thing. He was acknowledging the hearing outcome and making a formal withdrawal of all claims against the Ashford Eastern Meadow easement, and proposing in the final paragraph a new conversation about a shared water access arrangement that might benefit both properties. He was offering her an opening. She read it twice. Then she set it on her desk and looked at it for a while. Benjamin came in while she was looking at it. He read it over her shoulder without asking, something he'd started doing quietly, inserting himself into the flow of estate business, without taking it over present, without possessive, and when he finished, he made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "He's not beaten," Benjamin said. "He's regrouping." "Yes." She picked up the letter and folded it. "But he's also choosing to approach me directly this time, not through legal mechanisms, not through a solicitor with falsified documents." She set it aside. "That's information." "What kind?" She looked at him. "The kind that tells me he'd rather negotiate than fight. Which means he understands now who he's negotiating with." She reached for her pen. "I'm going to respond. The water access issue is legitimate. Both properties do have a claim on the creek in the north section, and we've been lucky so far that it hasn't become contentious. Better to settle it on our terms than his." Benjamin was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that particular attention he'd developed. "You're going to turn him into an ally," he said slowly. "I'm going to turn him into a neutralized neighbor," she corrected. "An ally is something you choose. A neutralized neighbor is something you manage." She picked up the pen. "They're different things." He looked at her for another moment, and then he pulled the chair from the corner of the room up to the desk beside her, not across from her, beside her, and said, "Tell me what you're thinking." She glanced at him. Something in her chest did the small, cautious movement it had been doing more frequently lately. She kept her face composed. "I'm thinking that you could pour us both some coffee, and I'll walk you through it." He got up and poured the coffee. They worked through it together for 2 hours. It was the first time that had ever happened. Miriam left at the end of July, and Eleanor left with her, and the house went quiet in the way that houses go quiet after family has gone. Not empty, but recalibrated. Abigail stood on the front steps, watching the carriage move down the lane, and felt the particular quality of a house that was now definitively hers to determine. Eleanor had embraced her at the door with genuine warmth that was nothing like the civil arm's-length affection she'd offered in the first year of Abigail's marriage. "You're different," Eleanor had said, not quietly enough for it to be entirely private. "Am I?" Abigail said. Harder. Then, before Abigail could respond, "But in the right places. The places that needed it." She'd pulled back and looked at her with those sharp, dark eyes. "Don't go soft too fast. He hasn't finished earning it yet." "I know," Abigail had said. Eleanor had smiled. "Yes, I believe you do." Now she stood on the steps with James in her arms, watching the lane settle back to quiet, and she thought about what earning looked like in practice. Not in gesture or in declared intention. Those were the easy parts, and she'd learned not to be impressed by easy parts. Earning looked like consistency in the moments that weren't being observed. Earning looked like what a man did when he didn't know anyone was paying attention. She had been paying attention. The test she hadn't planned for came from a direction she should have anticipated. His name was William Harker, and he was a friend of Benjamin's from their years together in Charlottesville. An easy, charming man who rode well and told good stories and had the particular quality of effortless superiority that some men of his class were born into and never thought to question. He arrived at Ashford Manor on a Thursday afternoon in early August, with no warning and a change of clothes in his saddlebag, and the cheerful expectation of someone who had always been welcomed everywhere. She didn't dislike him. He was pleasant to her, courteous, attentive at the dinner table, the kind of guest who knew how to be entertaining without requiring effort from his hosts. But she noticed on the first evening the way he talked to Benjamin. The way old friendships have their own register, their own private shorthand, that excluded the room around them without meaning to. She didn't mind that she understood it. What she minded was something smaller and more specific. When the conversation turned to the Doyle matter, which it did, because Benjamin brought it up, William Harker listened with interest and then turned to Benjamin with a look of straightforward admiration. Well handled. Smart move with the records office. I wouldn't have thought of it. Benjamin opened his mouth. Abigail reached for her wine glass. She waited. She had told herself she was not keeping a ledger. That was still true. But she was in this moment conducting a very specific observation, and she needed to see the result without interference. Abigail found the discrepancy, Benjamin said, clearly, without pause, without qualification. She's the one who went to the records office and found the original document. She identified the falsification and presented it to the judge. He looked across the table at her. I came with her. That was the extent of my contribution. William looked between them. Something recalibrated in his expression. Mrs. Ashford, with a different quality of attention than he'd given her before. I mean to say. That's remarkable. It needed doing, she said simply. She took a sip of wine. Inside, very quietly, something that had been braced released slightly. He hadn't taken the credit. He hadn't accepted it passively when it was offered to him by a man who had no reason to investigate further. He'd corrected it simply and completely, in front of someone whose opinion he cared about. That was earning. That was the kind of moment Eleanor had told her to watch for. William stayed 4 days. On the last evening when Abigail had retired early because James had been difficult all afternoon, and she needed an hour of quiet. She heard the two men in the study below, their voices muffled by the floor, but audible in the particular way that Ashford Manor's architecture, with its quirks of wood and plaster, sometimes allowed. She was not listening intentionally. She was sitting in the chair in her sitting room with a cup of cold tea and James sleeping against her shoulder, and the voices came up through the floor, and she sat still, and she heard. She's changed you. William's voice, curious rather than critical. Or something has. I couldn't put my finger on it until the dinner conversation. But you're different, Ben. You're more honest. Benjamin's voice was dry. More present. It's like you've... A pause, a creak of a chair. Like you actually see what's in front of you now. When you talked about her just now, you didn't sound like a man describing his wife's achievements. You sounded like a man who was proud. Genuinely. Not the social kind. A silence. I am, Benjamin said. And then, after a pause that she felt even through the floor, I wasted a great deal of time not being. I can't undo that. I'm not trying to. Another pause. I'm just trying to make sure she knows it's true now. That it isn't me trying to balance a ledger. It's me actually seeing her. Finally. Does she know that? She's the most perceptive person I've ever met, Benjamin said. She knows everything. She's just deciding whether it's enough. William made a sound that might have been a laugh, quiet and not unkind. And is it? Do you think? I think, Benjamin said carefully, that she will tell me when she's decided. and that the best thing I can do in the meantime is keep being worth the deciding. Abigail sat very still. James breathed against her shoulder, small and warm and steady. She sat there for a long time after the voices downstairs shifted to other things, and she held her son, and she thought about what it meant to be seen. Actually seen the way she'd asked for. Not performed at, not accounted for, not valued for the function she provided. Seen. She thought she was beginning to know what it felt like. The accounting crisis arrived in September. It was not the kind of crisis that announced itself. It came in through the back of the quarterly books in a discrepancy that Abigail found on a Tuesday evening while reviewing the milling accounts. A discrepancy she initially attributed to a clerical error and spent 20 minutes trying to reconcile before she understood what she was actually looking at. Someone had been skimming from the mill revenues. Not dramatically. Not the kind of theft that was meant to be gotten away with forever, but only long enough to matter. The kind of careful, intelligent pilfering that understood how to stay beneath the line of obvious notice. Small amounts, irregular intervals, never the same figure twice. It had been going on for at least 8 months. She sat with the books open in front of her, and she felt the particular cold clarity that came over her when something required immediate action and emotion was not useful. She went through it 3 more times to be certain. Then she went to find Benjamin. He was in the study. She set the open ledger on the desk in front of him without preamble and put her finger on the first discrepancy. Mill revenues. 8 months at minimum. I need you to look at this with me. He looked. He was quiet for a long time, turning the pages the way she'd shown him, following the pattern she'd identified. Dillard, he asked. Not as an accusation, as a question. No, Dillard doesn't have independent access to the mill receipts. This is someone at the mill itself. She leaned over the desk. The register clerk. His name is Colton. He's been there 3 years. I've never had cause to question him. How much? She told him the number. Benjamin's jaw tightened. What do you want to do? He asked. She noticed again that he asked it that way. Not here's what we'll do. Not I'll handle it from here. He asked her because they both understood by now that this was her territory, and she'd earned the right to determine the approach. I want to confront him directly. Before he knows we've found it. If we bring it to a magistrate first, he'll have time to construct a story. If we go to him with the records in hand, he won't. You want to go to the mill? Tomorrow morning. Early. Before the day's register is started. She looked at him. I want you to come. He held her gaze. Then I'll come. They rode out to the mill at first light. Colton was there when they arrived, opening up the register for the day, a man in his middle 30s who had the pleasant, forgettable quality of someone who had spent years being overlooked and had decided to capitalize on it. He looked up when the Ashfords came through the door, and his expression did something fast and complicated before it settled into careful deference. Abigail set the ledger on his counter without greeting. The mill receipts from January through August. I've been reviewing them. I'd like you to explain the discrepancies. Colton's face went through several changes in rapid succession. Abigail watched each one with the patience of a woman who had read enough ledgers to know that guilt had a very predictable sequence of expressions. I'm not sure what you... Page 7. March 14th. The daily total recorded in the register does not match the total in the weekly aggregate. The difference is $4.11. Would you like to explain that? Silence. Page 11. She continued, her voice absolutely level. March 28th. The same pattern. Page 14. April 5th. Page 16. Page 19. Page 22. She looked at him. Shall I keep going, or would you like to save us both some time? Colton's carefully maintained pleasantness collapsed completely. He looked at Benjamin. The instinct of a man who wanted to appeal to another man over the head of the woman doing the accounting. Benjamin didn't move. He stood at Abigail's shoulder with his arms crossed and an expression that made his position entirely clear. Mrs. Ashford found it, was all he said. Address her. The words hit the room like a physical thing. Colton looked back at Abigail. His shoulders dropped. I can pay it back. The pleasantness was entirely gone now, replaced by something older and more desperate. I had debts. I know that's not. I know it doesn't excuse it. But I can pay it back. Most of it. You'll pay all of it, Abigail said. Every cent. I have the full accounting here. She touched the ledger. I am not at this moment choosing to involve the magistrate. That decision will depend on what happens in the next 10 minutes. She looked at him steadily. Tell me everything. Who else knew? Whether anyone at the estate was involved. Whether any of the receipts were falsified rather than just rerouted. He told her everything. It took 20 minutes. By the end of it, she knew it was contained. Colton alone, no one at the house involved the receipts accurate in their recording, if not in their destination. She also knew by the end of it that he was a man who'd made a bad choice and knew it and had been living with the weight of it for 8 months. She was not sentimental about theft. She had no capacity for it. But she was not interested in destruction either when a different outcome would serve the estate's interests better. You'll repay the full amount on a schedule I will set, she told him. You'll be supervised directly by Mr. Dillard going forward, and your access to the receipt totals will be limited until the repayment is complete. If there is a single discrepancy in any record from this point forward, I will go to the magistrate the same day. She closed the ledger. Those are the terms. Do you agree to them? He agreed. They rode back to Ashford Manor with the morning coming up bright across the fields, and Abigail sat straight in the saddle with the ledger in her saddlebag, and the clean feeling she always had after a complicated thing had been managed clearly and without waste. Benjamin rode beside her. He was quiet for a while. You gave him a way out. I gave the estate a better outcome. Prosecuting him would have cost more in legal fees and lost work than the repayment schedule, and word would have gotten around in a way that made the mill's credibility harder to maintain. She glanced at him. The right answer isn't always the most satisfying one. He was quiet again for a moment. When I was 20. My father took me to a magistrate hearing over a dispute with one of our tenants. The tenant had misrepresented the yield from his parcel for 2 seasons running. My father prosecuted him, had him removed from the land. He paused. I always thought that was the right way to handle it, the principle of the thing. And now? Now I think my father cared more about being righteous than about being effective. He looked at her. You're more effective. She said nothing for a moment. Your father wasn't wrong, she said finally. Principle matters. I didn't let it go entirely the supervision, the repayment, those are consequences. I just chose consequences that served us better than theater. She looked ahead at the lane that curved toward home. I had a good teacher. Who? Mrs. Caulfield. She told me that goodwill is capital, same as silver. Destroying a man publicly when you can manage him privately costs you goodwill with everyone who's watching. And everyone is always watching. Benjamin absorbed that. I want to meet Mrs. Caulfield. She'll enjoy that considerably, Abigail said. She's been curious about you. He asked her on a Friday evening in the middle of September to walk with him. Not to discuss anything, just to walk. The evenings had turned that particular quality of Virginia September, the heat of summer, giving way to something cooler and cleaner. The light going golden in a way that made everything look like it was being preserved in amber. She left James with Hannah and went. They walked the south boundary of the estate, which she knew well, and he was learning. He asked her questions about the land, not estate management questions, but the kind of questions a person asks when they're trying to understand a place through the eyes of someone who knows it better. She answered. He listened. They walked. At the fence line between the Ashford South pasture and the Cressley property, he stopped. She stopped beside him. I owe you an apology. A real one. Not the kind not what I've been doing these past months, which is trying to show you rather than say it. You deserve both. She looked at the fence line. For February, she asked. For all of it. He turned to face her. For 2 years of looking at you and not seeing you. For letting you carry this estate while I accepted the credit that came from holding the name. For making you feel like a function in someone else's life when you are the most extraordinary person I've shared mine with. His voice was steady, but the steadiness was costing him. For sitting in that study with Olivia Whitmore and saying things out loud that I should have examined privately and discarded privately because they weren't even true. They were a story I'd been telling myself because I didn't understand what I had. And the fact that I didn't understand it doesn't make the saying of it any less. Stop. Quietly. He stopped. She was quiet for a moment, looking out over the south pasture in the golden light. You don't have to perform this for me. I don't need a confession. I need you to mean what you've been doing. And I think you do. I think it's real. She turned and looked at him. But I also need you to understand something, Benjamin. I'm not the same woman who stood in that hallway in February. I'm not going back to being her. What we build from here has to have room for who I am now, for what I know I'm worth, for the decisions I make and the work I do and the voice I have in my own life. She held his gaze. Can you live with that? He looked at her. I can do more than live with it. I can be glad of it. Abigail, He stopped, then started again carefully. I don't want the woman who stood in that hallway in February. I want the woman who walked out of it and built something in spite of what she'd heard. I want the woman who sat across from Rutherford Doyle's legal challenge and dismantled it with a document she'd had in her bag since before the fight had even started. He took a breath. I want you. This version. The one you had to nearly lose everything to become. That's what I'm asking to be part of. She looked at him for a long time. The last of the light was going across the fields. You are asking me to stay, she said quietly, because you finally understand what you would lose. I need to know you would have chosen me even if I hadn't changed. Even if I'd stayed exactly as I was, managing quietly, asking for nothing, making myself useful without demanding to be seen. He didn't answer quickly. She would not have trusted a quick answer. I thought about it. She watched him think, watched the careful honesty working behind his eyes. No. I don't think I would have. Not then. Because the problem was never you, Abigail. The problem was me. I wasn't... He stopped. I wasn't awake enough. I wasn't looking. And I can't tell you that I would have woken up on my own because I don't know that it's true. I think it took... His jaw worked. I think it took you becoming undeniable. For someone like me. For someone who'd spent so long looking at what he thought he'd lost that he couldn't see what he had. He met her eyes. I'm ashamed of that. I want to be clear that I am ashamed of it. But I'd rather be honest with you than comfortable with myself. The silence between them was the most real silence they'd ever shared. She turned and looked back at the pasture. That, she said finally, is the most honest thing you have ever said to me. I'm trying to be the kind of man who says honest things. She was quiet for a moment longer. Then, walk back with me. He fell into step beside her. Not behind her, not ahead. Beside. October came in quietly, and with it a new rhythm at Ashford Manor that hadn't existed before. The estate meetings happened at the desk in Abigail's sitting room, because that was where the books were, and Benjamin came to them and sat beside her and contributed in the ways he was learning to contribute with the financial contacts. His name opened with the social navigation that was genuinely his strength, with a willingness to be the public face of decisions that she had made. They divided the territory not by gender, but by competence, and she noticed that when it was distributed that way, there wasn't much he resented about it. James began to have opinions about the world. He was 4 months old and had recently discovered that sounds produced reactions, and he was conducting extensive experiments on this subject at all hours. Benjamin, who had surprised her by turning out to have a natural ease with the baby that she had not anticipated from a man of his reserve, would carry him around the house in the evenings, doing a low-running commentary on whatever he was looking at, as if the baby were a reasonable audience for observations about architecture and account management and the character of various county neighbors. She heard it from the hallway one evening without him knowing she was there. That's the south pasture fence, he was telling James, who was looking at the window with the deep, unconvinced interest of a 4-month-old. Your mother negotiated the boundary rights on it before you were born. Actually, before I knew enough to be paying attention. A pause. She also saved the mill accounts in September and managed Rutherford Doyle's retreat with more efficiency than most generals I've read about. She's remarkable, your mother. I expect you'll figure that out on your own. But I wanted to tell you early in case it helps. Abigail stood in the hallway. She pressed her back to the wall. She did not go into the room. She stood there for a moment, with her hand over her mouth, and she felt the thing that had been frozen since February thaw the rest of the way. Not in a dramatic rush. Quietly. The way ice goes in the first real warmth of spring, not all at once but steadily, and then suddenly there is water where there wasn't. She straightened up. She breathed. She walked to the doorway. Come to dinner. Both of you. Benjamin turned. He looked at her face and went very still the way he did when he understood something he hadn't been told directly. All right, he said quietly. He carried James to dinner. She walked beside him. And in the dining room of Ashford Manor, in the autumn of 1813, with the candles lit, and the baby in his father's arms, and the accounts balanced in the sitting room, and the south pasture fence standing along a boundary that would not be challenged again in all of that ordinary, irreplaceable fullness. Abigail Mercer. Ashford felt for the first time in a very long time that she was not bracing against something. She was simply there. And it was enough. For now, it was enough. What came next would be its own question. But she was not afraid of questions anymore. The winter that settled over Ashford Manor in December of 1813 was not the kind that isolates. It was the kind that clarifies. Abigail had always found winter useful for that, the way the cold stripped everything back to what was actually there, the way the shorter days forced a reckoning with how you were spending the light you had. She moved through the house with James on her hip, and the estate accounts in her head, and a new quality she'd been developing since October that she didn't have a precise word for yet. Not peace. Peace implied an absence of difficulty, and there was plenty of difficulty. Something more durable than peace. Something that didn't depend on circumstances being favorable. She had started, she thought, to belong to herself. That was the closest she could get to naming it. James was 5 months old, and had recently decided that sleeping through the night was a suggestion rather than a requirement, which meant that both his parents were moving through December in a state of cheerful exhaustion that had unexpectedly become one of the most honest things between them. There was no posturing at 3 in the morning, no careful management of impression. When Benjamin appeared in the doorway of the nursery at 2:30, with his hair disordered and his eyes barely open, asking if he should take the baby for a while, he was not performing consideration. He was simply there, and she was simply grateful. And it turned out that simple was the register they'd both been missing. She handed James over. She went back to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to Benjamin's voice through the wall, that low, steady murmur he'd developed for the baby, half narration and half nonsense, and entirely genuine. And she felt the strange tenderness of loving someone clearly. Not blindly, not hopefully. Clearly, with full knowledge of what they were and weren't, and choosing it anyway. She hadn't told him that yet. She was still deciding when. The letter from Olivia Whitmore came on a Wednesday in the first week of December, which was the kind of timing that made Abigail wonder briefly about Providence. It was brief and well written, the way everything Olivia wrote was well written, and it contained exactly 2 pieces of information: that Olivia had married James Pemberton in a small ceremony in Lynchburg the previous Saturday, and that she wished the Ashford family well in the year ahead. No elaboration, no apology, no excess. Abigail respected that. She was sitting with the letter when Benjamin came in for morning coffee, and she looked up and handed it to him without comment. He read it. He set it on the table. He poured his coffee and sat down. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Are you all right?" Abigail asked. He looked at her across the table with an expression that was very direct and very clear. "Yes, I am." And then, after a pause, "Are you asking because you think I'm not, or because you want to know?" "Because I want to know." He held her gaze. "I'm all right. I haven't been, Abigail. Whatever I felt then, or thought I felt, it was built out of something I invented. A version of a life I thought I'd lost that I never actually had." He looked at the letter once more, and then away. "I hope she's happy. I mean that genuinely. And I feel—" He considered. "I feel nothing else. That's the truth." She nodded. She believed him. Not because she was naive, or because she wanted it to be true, but because she had been watching Benjamin Ashford carefully for 10 months, and she had learned to read him. He was not a man who hid what he felt. He was a man who had spent years failing to examine what he felt, which was a different problem entirely, and one he was visibly genuinely working on. She picked up her tea. "Then I'm glad, for both of you." He looked at her with that expression she'd been cataloging since September, the one that was too steady to be longing and too alive to be mere affection. "Abigail," he started. "Not yet," she said quietly, not unkindly. He stopped. He understood what she meant. He'd learned to understand what she meant without requiring it to be fully articulated, which was itself a kind of proof. "All right," and went back to his coffee. Mrs. Caulfield came for tea that Friday, which she had taken to doing with a frequency that suggested it had graduated from courtesy to genuine habit. She was 70 now, and sharper than ever, and she had taken to James with the particular warmth she reserved for things she considered worth investing in. She held him while Abigail poured tea, and she told him extremely practical things about the nature of the world, in a tone usually reserved for board meetings, and James listened with the focused gravity of a baby who intended to take notes. "He'll be a serious one," Mrs. Caulfield said. "You can tell early. They either watch the room or perform for it. This one watches." "He gets it from his father," Abigail said. Mrs. Caulfield looked at her over the baby's head with those bright assessing eyes. "And how is his father?" "Better," Abigail said. "Genuinely better. It's not something I'm telling myself to believe, it's something I can see." Mrs. Caulfield adjusted James on her knee. "And how are you?" Abigail thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm good. I'm actually good, not in spite of what happened, because of what I built in the middle of it." She looked down at her teacup. "I used to think the goal was to get back to where I was before February, to have the marriage I thought I had. And somewhere in the past 10 months, I realized that what I had before it wasn't wrong exactly, but it wasn't enough. It was a good structure with no real life in it. What we have now is messier, harder earned." She looked up. "More real." Mrs. Caulfield regarded her for a long moment. "You know what your mother was like when I knew her?" she asked. Abigail went still. Mrs. Caulfield rarely spoke of her mother. "She was generous to a fault," the older woman said. "She gave everything she had to everyone around her and held very little back for herself. She loved your father completely, and he deserved it. He was a good man. But she had a way of disappearing into the people she loved, of becoming the shape of their needs rather than her own." She looked at James, then back at Abigail. "You are your mother's daughter in the ways that matter. The warmth, the loyalty, the honesty." A pause. "But you are not disappearing. And I think she would have felt very steadied by that." Abigail set down her teacup carefully. Her throat was tight in a way she hadn't expected. "Thank you," she managed. "Don't thank me," Mrs. Caulfield said briskly. "I'm just accounting for what I see. It's what I do." She held James up slightly and addressed him directly. "Your grandmother would have liked your mother very much. Make sure you grow up knowing that." James reached for her nose. She allowed it. The evening that changed everything, not dramatically, not with the force of a door left open, and words that were never meant to be heard, but with the quiet certainty of something that had been building for 10 months and was finally ready, began unremarkably. Benjamin had been in Charlottesville for 2 days on estate business. The Greer Consortium expansion had required his presence in a way that hers couldn't be this time, because the meeting involved 3 men who were willing to negotiate with a woman's document, but not yet willing to negotiate across a table from one without a male name attached to the transaction. She had accepted this with the pragmatism she brought to most things. She couldn't change the world's architecture in a morning, but she could keep building her own position within it until the architecture had to account for her. She'd sent him with precise notes and exact figures, and a clear hierarchy of acceptable terms versus walking points, and she'd trusted him to use them correctly. He came back on a Thursday evening, and before he'd even taken off his coat, He came to find her in the sitting room, where she was feeding James his last meal of the day. They accepted the full terms. Every clause. Greer tried to push back on the maintenance schedule, and I held the line exactly where you said to. He looked at her with something that wasn't quite amazement, but was close to it. He backed down within 2 minutes. You'd calculated exactly how much leverage we had. I know the numbers, she said simply. Abigail. He came further into the room, sat in the chair across from her. His coat was still on. He'd clearly come directly from the horse. They asked in the meeting who had structured the arrangement. Greer's partner asked directly. I told them you had. She looked at him. All three of them, he continued, asked if you'd be present at the next meeting. She absorbed that. Something warm and specific moved through her chest. And what did you tell them? I told them that if they wanted the arrangement to keep working at the level it was working, they'd better make sure my wife had a seat at the table. He held her gaze. I told them that as a matter of fact, not as a favor, and that anyone who had a problem with it was welcome to find another mill. The room was very quiet. James made a small, satisfied sound against her shoulder. You said that? I did. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had sat in a study in February and said words that had cracked her open. This man who had come down to the garden because she'd asked, who had stayed through 9 hours of labor without being told to, who had stood in front of his old friend and corrected the credit, who had told his sleeping son that his mother was remarkable while no one was listening, who had just told 3 businessmen in Charlottesville that the woman at the center of their arrangement would have a seat at their table or they could find another arrangement. Benjamin. Her voice was very quiet. He looked at her. I'm ready. He went very still. She felt the weight of those 2 words between them all the months of not yet, and wait, and I believe you, but that's not the same as forgiving you, and she let it settle. Ready, he said slowly, like he was testing the word, making sure he understood it correctly. To stop holding the distance. To stop. I've been waiting to feel certain. Waiting to reach some point where I could guarantee myself that it was safe to come back the rest of the way. She looked at James in her arms and then back at her husband. But I don't think that point exists. I think certainty is something you build forward, not something you arrive at. She held his gaze. And I want to build forward, with you, as equals, as people who actually see each other. A pause. If that's still what you want. He got up from the chair. He crossed the room and crouched down in front of her, which put him below her eye level, which she thought was probably intentional, and which told her more than a speech would have. He looked up at her the way a man looks at something he knows he almost lost and has decided never to take for granted again. It is the only thing I want. She looked at him. Then she shifted James to one arm and held out her free hand. I took it, both of his hands around hers, the wedding ring between them warm from her skin. They stayed like that for a while. No theatrics, no declaration that tried to undo the past with the force of feeling. Just the weight of his hands, and the baby breathing between them, and the sitting room with its account books, and its cold tea, and its complicated earned entirely real life. It was nothing like what she'd imagined marriage would be when she was 22, and standing at a window at the Callaway gathering, watching a man on the other side of the room. It was better. The winter moved through its months, and spring came back to the Ashford estate the way it always did, without asking permission, without waiting for anyone to be ready. The dogwoods went white along the lower grounds. The Holt family's new child arrived in March, and Daniel Holt came to the house to tell them, hat in hand, pleased and proud, and Abigail sent Hannah back with a basket and a length of good linen, and a note that she'd written herself rather than delegating. James learned to sit up in April. Benjamin was in the room when it happened. He'd arranged his mornings quietly and without announcement, so that he was generally in the house during the hours when things were likeliest to happen, and the look on his face when the baby pushed himself upright and wobbled there with the profound satisfaction of someone who has achieved something monumental, was the kind of look that Abigail stored away in the part of herself where she kept things she didn't want to forget. The Greer Consortium meeting in March had gone well. She had sat at the table. 3 men who had previously conducted all their business with her husband had directed their questions to her within 20 minutes of the meeting starting, because she had the answers, and they were practical men, and practicality won over convention when the numbers were clear enough. Greer's partner, a man named Voss, had walked her to the door at the end and said with a straightforward respect that required no interpretation, "Mrs. Ashford, I've been in commerce for 30 years. I don't say this often. You have one of the finest business minds I've encountered." She had thanked him and meant it, and then gone to find Benjamin, who was waiting outside with the horses, and she had told him what Voss said. Benjamin had looked at her with an expression that was entirely uncomplicated. "He's right. I've known that for months. I'm glad he caught up." She had laughed. It was the first time she'd laughed in front of him, genuinely fully, without managing it, in a very long time. The conversation that finished building what they were to each other happened on a May evening when James was almost a year old, and the estate was in the best condition it had been in a decade, and the sitting room where Abigail worked had quietly accumulated 2 chairs instead of 1. They were sitting after dinner, not working, not conducting business, simply sitting the way 2 people sit when they've stopped needing the cover of activity. And Benjamin set down the book he hadn't really been reading and looked at her. "I want to tell you something. And I don't want you to respond until I'm finished." She marked her page. She looked at him. "When I was in that study in February, I was not lying to Olivia. I want to be clear about that. What I said I believed when I said it. I had been carrying a version of a life I thought I should have had, and I'd been carrying it so long it had become real to me. The way a wound becomes familiar." He paused. "But I was lying to myself. Because the version of a life I thought I'd lost it was a story. It didn't have anything real in it. It didn't have someone who rode out to the Harmon land in a cold March wind and solved in an afternoon what lawyers had made worse for 2 years. It didn't have someone who sat across from a county judge and laid out a falsified document with the clarity of a person who had been prepared for exactly that moment for months." He stopped. "It didn't have you. What I was mourning was an absence I'd invented, and what I was ignoring was a presence I'd been given and didn't have the eyes to see." She was very still. "I spent years," he continued, "believing that responsibility was the same as love. That if I kept the obligation provided, maintained, remained. I was doing what was required of me, and that was sufficient. You taught me that love without choice is not love at all. It is merely a duty honored. And duty without the choosing is a cage that looks like a house." He looked at her with the directness she had come to understand was the most Benjamin Ashford thing about him. The willingness, once he'd located it, to see something completely and say it exactly as it was. "I choose you. Not the woman who might have stayed if I'd been kinder. Not the woman who managed quietly and asked for nothing. This woman. The one who took her wedding ring off in the dark and put it back on because she decided she would determine when it came off, not pain." His voice went quieter. "I would choose you every morning. I would choose you knowing everything. I would choose you even knowing that you don't need me to, especially knowing that." The room was absolutely still. She let the words settle the way she let everything settle completely, without rushing toward a response, before she understood what she actually felt. What she felt was this: not vindication, though she'd earned it. Not relief, though it was present. Something simpler and more durable. The feeling of being known by the person who was supposed to know you, which is one of the things human beings need most and receive least often. "I know. I know you mean that." "Is that enough?" he asked. And the question had no performance in it, no dread, no manipulation. He was simply asking the way a man asks a question he genuinely doesn't know the answer to. She thought about the woman who had stood in a hallway with a candle and walked back to her room and taken off her ring and decided in the dark that she would choose herself first. She thought about everything she'd built in the 10 months since. The accounts and the boundary documents and the archive rooms and the consortium table. The relationship with Mrs. Caulfield and the trust of the Harmon family and the network of small, solid, reliable things she'd constructed out of her own competence and her own determination. The woman she'd become in the building of them. She thought about James, who watched the room the way serious people watch rooms. She thought about the chair that had appeared in her sitting room without either of them remarking on it. She looked at her husband. "It's more than enough. It's everything I actually wanted. Not the having of you. The real choosing with eyes open, knowing who we both are." She held his gaze. "That's what I wanted, and that's what this is." He let out a breath. It was not a theatrical exhale. It was the exhale of a man who has been holding something for a very long time and has finally been told he can set it down. "Then we're all right. We're better than all right. We're honest. That's harder to build and worth considerably more." He smiled then, a real smile, the kind that reached all the way, the kind she saw more often now, and that had not gotten less remarkable with repetition. She smiled back. They did not have a perfect marriage. She would have mistrusted a perfect marriage. Perfection required the absence of the difficult things, and the difficult things were precisely what had built them into something worth having. They disagreed. They negotiated. There were mornings when the old patterns pulled at both of them, him toward assumption, her toward silence, and they had to actively choose the different way they'd built together. They chose it. Every time they chose it. James grew into a boy who watched rooms and asked extremely precise questions and had inherited, as far as anyone could tell, his mother's comprehensive memory and his father's careful attention. He sat in the estate meetings by the time he was old enough to sit still for 20 minutes, not because his parents required it, but because he wanted to, and Abigail answered his questions about the accounts with the same directness she brought to everything, and she did not simplify for him, and he rewarded her by not needing her to. The Greer Consortium expanded twice. The milling arrangement became one of the most profitable ventures in the county, and people drove considerable distances to use it, and they negotiated with Abigail Ashford because she was the one who understood the numbers and set the terms and kept everything running with the methodical precision that was her signature and her gift. Rutherford Doyle became in the end a neutralized neighbor, and then something approaching an occasionally useful one. The water access arrangement she'd negotiated held without incident. He never challenged another Ashford boundary. He told someone once in a context that got back to her that Mrs. Ashford was the most formidable negotiator he'd encountered, and that he'd learned that lesson more expensively than he would have liked. She considered that a satisfactory outcome. Mrs. Caulfield came for tea every Friday until she was 81. And then she came every other Friday and made no concession to the reduced frequency beyond mentioning once that the road was longer than it used to be, which it wasn't. She held James on her knee and told him practical things about the world until he was old enough to be embarrassed by it. And then she told him anyway, because she was 73 and immune to the opinions of children who hadn't yet figured out that she was right. Eleanor Ashford came twice a year and stayed 2 weeks each time, and maintained a running assessment of her brother's behavior that she delivered to Abigail with the directness of a woman who had given up on circumspection as a lost cause. The assessment after the first year was consistently positive, which she communicated by never once suggesting he hadn't finished earning it. Abigail took that as the highest compliment Eleanor was capable of. One morning in the spring of 1815, when the dogwoods were out again, and James was walking with the determined wobble of a child who has recently discovered forward momentum and intends to use it continuously, Benjamin came to find her in the sitting room, where she was reviewing the quarterly accounts. He stood in the doorway and looked at her with that clear, particular attention. "What?" she asked without looking up. "Nothing. I just wanted to see where you were." She set down her pen. She looked at him. "I'm right here." "I know." He came in and sat in the chair that was his, now that had been his since October of 1813, without either of them ever formally deciding it, and he looked at her across the account books and the cold tea and the document she'd been annotating and the settled working real life between them. "I spent years," he said quietly, "not knowing where you were, even when you were in the same room." "I know. I won't do that again." "I know that too." She looked at him for a moment longer. This man who had looked at her wrong for 2 years and had spent 2 years after learning to look right, who had earned his way back. Not with grand gestures, but with the daily, unremarkable, irreplaceable practice of actually seeing her. Then she picked up her pen. There's a discrepancy in the March mill receipts. I need another set of eyes. He pulled his chair to her side of the desk. He looked at the numbers. She showed him where. They worked through it together in the spring light of the sitting room side by side, the account book spread between them. James audible in the hallway, conducting his own investigations at floor level. The estate humming along outside in the way of a thing that has been tended carefully by people who understand its worth. This was the life they had built. Not from the beginning. The beginning had been well-intentioned and incomplete, a structure with good bones and no real foundation. This life had been built from the middle. From a hallway in February, and a candle and a ring taken off in the dark, and a woman who had decided in the worst moment she'd known that she would build something out of it, or she would not recognize herself in the trying. She had built it. They had built it. And on a spring morning in 1815, with the dogwoods white outside, and the account spread open between them and her husband's shoulder, warm against hers, and her son's voice carrying down the hall, and the whole complicated, imperfect, deeply real edifice of their life, standing solid around her. Abigail Mercer. Ashford understood with the clean certainty of something that had been tested and held, that she had not simply survived what happened in that hallway. She had used it. She had taken the worst night of her life and built a better one. And the man beside her, the man who had finally, completely, irrevocably chosen her, would spend the rest of his life being grateful that she had. That was not a small thing. That was